everyone, and thank you for tuning in to watch our panel. I will begin now. On July 14th, 1790, exactly a year after the storming of the Bastille, the daily journal Le Patriote Français, led by Girondin leader Jacques-Pierre Brissot, published a small announcement on its last page, inviting all young siblings Puinais from the Pays de Droit écrit to join a meeting that would be held at the home of a certain avocat Villon to discuss some very important matters. Those important matters involved the promotion of new legislation regarding egalitarian succession within the family, which would finally bring an end to the despotism of fathers. The meeting was initiated by a group of revolutionaries originally from the South, most of whom were members of the Cercle Social and associated with the Société des Amis des Noirs, the French anti-slavery group founded in 1788. During that first meeting, they named themselves the Society of Friends for the Union and Equality of the Family. La Société des Amis de l'Union et de l'Égalité dans la Famille. And their main purpose was to abolish the old and compounded inheritance customs that existed in France and promulgate a homogeneous legislation that granted equal division of property among all siblings. The group did not have a long career. They were quickly absorbed in the Confédération des Amis de la Vérité, yet their agenda reflected long-growing ideological currents about equality and compassion in the family. Furthermore, their cause tapped into long-existing concerns among a wide section of the French society regarding transmission of property, the preservation of the family line, and paternal authority. Their first meeting bore fruit, and a month later, François Xavier Lantena, the unofficial group leader, addressed the Assemblée Nationale on behalf of the Puinais, laying out their claims. The abolition of feudalism would not suffice if the assembly was determined to create a free and egalitarian nation. Only egalitarian inheritance would contribute, and I quote, to the good mores, the peace of citizens, the decrease in trials, the improvement of agriculture and commerce, and eventually to the increase in population. This statement highlights the topic of this talk, which concerns the ways in which the matter of inheritance came to play a significant role in not only the politicization of the family, but also in the process through which the family became an object of empirical social scientific scrutiny. The subject of the family in the French Revolution has been rigorously studied in the historiography through a wide array of perspectives. Familial legal reforms and their implication in modern politics, the nuclearization of the family, and the creation of private-public spheres. Lynn Hunt, André Bourguière, Suzanne Descent, and Anne Verjus, to name just a few, have analyzed the intricate dynamics that emerge in the revolution between politics, law, and the family, and how they influenced and helped shape each other. The rich topic of the family in the political sphere is essential for the comprehension of the revolution and its long-lasting consequences. Nonetheless, I examine the family in the revolution from a different perspective, focusing on how the family, and especially its daily affairs, including inheritance, bookkeeping, and lineage, became central to the emergence of the social sciences in France, which is the subject of my dissertation. First, I demonstrate how the family entered a new domain of reflection during the period and how it was absorbed in the Sciences de l'Homme. I do this by discussing treatises written by members of the Society of Friends for the Union and Equality of the Family, from now on just the Society. Second, I show how the explosion in petitions and pamphlets regarding family inheritance helped the family gain cultural and epistemological salience, which galvanized social thinkers to re-examine it. I argue that during the revolution, the family moved from being principally a legal matter or a metaphor for political authority to an object that many believed should be studied empirically for the prosperity of society. The concept of society itself, as Keith Baker has shown, was a newly emergent ontological entity at the time, signifying, and I quote, a domain whose stability did not require the imposition of order from above and whose free action did not necessarily degenerate into anarchy and disorder from below. Since society was now envisioned as an association of equal individuals acting in relative harmony, the family, as the primary unit of social organization, had to be reconceptualized as well. And during the revolution, it became a much more urgent issue as it was seen as the last enclave of hierarchy and subordination in revolutionaries' minds. In this talk, I offer a reading that accentuates the fact that politics during the revolution never fully divorced from the social, as revisionist historiography had suggested, but the social questions, notably questions about families, their intimate interactions, and their property, were not secondary to political struggles, but in fact greatly entangled within them. My approach is different from the authors I've mentioned since I draw inspiration from the field of the history of science, and particularly the work done by Lorraine Daston and others on biographies of scientific objects. While it is true that the intellectual transformation of the family was a result of revolutionary ideology, centered on the premise that the family was the testing ground for creating a rights-bearing individual, we must also recognize the important role of new mechanisms of inquiry that were employed to understand and configure its nature, such as observations and experiments. In fact, I will show that there was a tight link between the emergence of the social sciences and the revolutionary ideology. If all society was now seen as composed of equal individuals, one could induce from a particular case about society as a whole and create a systematic study of families in society in France. I begin with two treatises written by members of our society. Since they were written at the first stages of the revolution, before the inheritance legislation was widely supported, the arguments reflect the ideas that the authors believed were most convincing for legitimizing their claims and for justifying their demands. Lantena, the leader of the society, was a physician, an aspiring homme de lettres, and a revolutionary deputy. On 1789, after several years of research, he published a erudite treatise about the harms of the droit d'aînesse, which received very good reviews. The treatise was organized in 5 chapters, and Lantena integrated many different fields of thought to justify egalitarian inheritance. Jurists' ideas, moralist writings, historical precedents, natural rights discourse, sentimental novels such as Clarissa by Richardson, and the works of Enlightenment philosophers such as Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Renal. But there are 2 arguments in particular which I would like to focus on. The first 2 chapters discuss the customs in the Pays de droit écrit and in the Pays de coutume. Most texts from the period drew the separation between the 2 areas, despite the fact that the inheritance regimes in France were much more diverse. Nevertheless, it is worth roughly outlining the map of inheritance law, even though in practice, things sometimes operated very differently. In the south, the population followed mainly the Roman law, where most fathers employed the droit de tester, which granted them great power over property division. Usually, they chose one heir to remain in the estate and left the rest with a small legitime. In the north, the custom of equal inheritance and nuclear household was more predominant, with pockets of areas still leaning to a favorable heir. In Normandy, as Suzanne Dessan has shown, there was an exception, as fathers employed equal inheritance, but only among the male offspring. Across central France and mostly around the Ile-de-France region, the customs were more flexible and merged the 2 patterns, granting descendants an opportunity to choose between the 2 after the death of the proprietor. After denouncing the moral hazards of each region's customs, Lantena presented medical explanations to prove the physical damages caused by these traditions. Stressing the veracity of his words, he cited a dissertation defended on September 13, 1784, at the Faculty of Medicine in the University of Reims. According to the dissertation, younger brothers and sisters become fearful and timid, and their health is altered and deteriorates due to the neglect of their parents. Furthermore, their reserved physique caused them convulsions, which occurred, according to the author, due to an amplified beating of the carotid artery on their optic nerve. Though the subject of family in the law has a long tradition, the choice to medicalize the effects of a legal custom of property devolution was a novel addition, and can be explained by several cultural developments. One of them is the paradigm of sensibility, which functioned as a bridge to explain the interdependence between the physical and the social realms. According to contemporaries, heightened sensibility in individuals could become a pathology and harm the social fabric by causing moral degeneration. But the same was true in the opposite direction. As we see here, relationships that were not instituted on sociability and compassion could affect the healthy bodies of individuals. Furthermore, the implantation of the family within the science de l'homme allowed it to be examined through epistemological perspective that had hitherto been seen as irrelevant to the matter of property legislation. Most notable in the text is the importance Lantena ascribed to education and its psychological, moral, and long-term physical effects. This is just a picture that is not directly connected to the argument. The rationale that Lantena wished to communicate to his readers was that inequality in the family did not stop with property transmission, but was felt within the household already from the cradle. Once parents chose their heir, the dynamics in the family changed, and the sisters and brothers left with a humble legitime were raised as second-rate, inferior members, always afraid of their parents' tacit intentions to push them out. To highlight this point, Lantena referred to the potential benefits of the science de l'homme in instructing fathers about their obligations towards their kin. Lantena's treatise is rich and complex, but there is one aspect that was left untreated. That is the economic consequences of the droit d'aînesse. In order to present a complete picture of all the intellectual fronts that were mobilized in the interest of redefining the family, I would like to discuss another text written by a member of the society, the Abbé Cournant. Cournant was a curious figure. Born in Marseille, where he taught rhetoric for 12 years, he eventually moved to Paris to become a literature professor at the Collège de France. Belonging to the more radical Parisian faction of the revolution, Cournant was an ardent abolitionist and a strong supporter for the marriage of priests. His text, De la propriété ou la cause du pauvre, was published in 1791. While the legislation of egalitarian succession intestate without a testament was underway. The text was not as erudite and eloquent as Lantena's, but its explosive and utopic content makes it worth our attention. Structured as a practical program, it was meant to serve as a blueprint of how to redistribute the French territory so that each citizen would receive an equal share of land for cultivation. For Cournant, the legislation of egalitarian inheritance was only the first step in what should be a much more expansive economic and social reform, the end of which would result in granting equal property to all. Cournant, like Lantena, found much optimism in the science de l'homme, writing that philosophy has finally achieved its real objective, that is the study of men and the relations that unite them. It was now the state's duty, he added, and I quote, to provide societies and each individual with a measure of happiness and perfection so that general prosperity is but a result of the particular happiness. Presented as the simple fulfillment of nature's plan, the basic outline was that if there were 25 million acres in France and 20 million people, each individual, man and woman, should receive 7 acres of land, from which a third would be reduced for the use of the state. The land given to the individual at the age of 25 was to be cultivated during one's lifetime and could not be bequeathed to future generations. With each child born, the family would receive an additional portion of land to be kept for the child until maturity. This solution, according to the author, would bring about a natural growth in population. To conclude this part, these treatises are but two of many examples of programs about inheritance reform circulating at the time. Yet juxtaposed, they illustrate the new intellectual fronts that were utilized to explore the intricate subject of the family and exemplify the centrality ascribed to inheritance in the regeneration of the social order. The paradigm of the science de l'homme slowly penetrated the debates, which contributed to the consolidation of the invisible but tenacious link between individual happiness, egalitarian familial structure, and a prospering society and economy. Another critical step in the intellectualization of the family, which I will discuss now, was the discursive eruption that flooded the public sphere around the new family laws. notably the Law of 17 of Nivelles, Year 2, that is January 6, 1794, which was the climax of egalitarian legislation in the family, though very quickly suspended by the Directory. The Law of 17 of Nivelles came after dramatic evolution in family law, the Constitution of Divorce, the Declaration of Marriage as a Civil Contract, and the legalization of adoption. It was similar to the decree promulgated on the 5th of Brumaire regarding succession, but it accentuated the retroactive effect. The retroactive effect meant that all donations made after 1789 were annulled, as well as any contractual commitments through marriages. Most importantly, all men and women of the church could demand their share of the succession, whether it was executed before or after 1789. The limitations on the right to will were extensive. An individual could only dispose of 1/10 of the goods if he or she had direct kin, and only 1/6 if he or she had collateral kin. Moreover, the disposable property was designated only to be bequeathed to someone outside of the family line, like charity, for example. Due to its severe implication, the decree unleashed an avalanche of contention and debate, mainly regarding its retroactive effect. Since the law touched the most vulnerable and sacred family matters, the future of one's children and patrimony, people from all across the social spectrum began studying the subject, adding their reflections, and joining the dispute. The rhetoric of the petition may seem hyperbolic in its patriotic tones, but there is much to learn from these petitions, which I unfortunately will not have time to expand on here. Most central to my talk is how the petitioner's lines of argument was presented. In the lion's share of the petitions, the framing of their demands is such that their own particular difficulties are presented as a typical example that speaks to the whole. Just one example is a petition written on behalf of the 60-year-old widow von Ernaud. She wrote to contest the law which would enforce her to return a significant share of an inheritance left to her by her cousin. After presenting her own claim, she added in the end, "It is on you, legislators, citizens, to repair similar calamities. They are the sacred principle in all legislations in the world. The social order persists essentially due to the maintenance of these principles of reason, equity, and universal morality." Another minor example, but an interesting one, to demonstrate the blurring of the lines between the particular and the general good, is this text by the sans-culotte Coulon, who writes, "A retroactive law upsets a great number of brave sans-culottes, and me first and foremost, and moi la première." He then continues by blurring the line between his own particular problem and the inconveniences of all the sans-culottes. One last example is the citizen Dupin from the Department of Isère, who began his petition titled "Observations on the Retroactive Effect of the Law of 17 of Nivelles" as such. Justice, probity, and reason highly demand the withdrawal of the retroactive effect. Article 9 is a formal infringement of the Declaration of Man. Yet after a few pages, he raised his own specific crisis. This is another example that I won't have time to discuss. Even if this was a standardized format designed to appeal to national legislators, it nevertheless exposes the rationale through which the systematization of the study of the family was constructed as an aggregation of cases. It was an empirical experiment that all citizens took part in and felt an obligation to report on. This inductive empirical case-based method fitted squarely with Enlightenment ideology, in which private interests were revalorized and individual happiness was tied to the foundation of social prosperity. In fact, the gradual flattening of society into an unhierarchical plateau of equal individuals signified in many of the minds of contemporaries that each individual could extrapolate the ways to achieve universal prosperity from his or her private experience. In this manner, the egalitarian ideology and the early social sciences fueled one another. To conclude, the family was not only politicized over the course of the revolution, it also came under a process of amplified intellectualization. This development permeated larger sections of the French society and had long-term effects on the way in which anthropology, sociology, and demography developed in France. Sociology, for example, pioneered by thinkers such as Frédéric Leplan, inherited the assumption that family structures were defined by inheritance and that those were key to social change. France is still pioneering in the fields of kinship studies, historical demography, and the sociology of the family. Why are inheritance, marriage, and kinship so prominent in the social sciences in France, and less so in the US, for example? There are many reasons to explain this phenomenon, but one surprising reason I suggest is the debates about inheritance that were unleashed in the French Revolution. Thank you very much.